You want to get rich, don't you? Financial freedom is the backbone of the American dream, after all. And while money can't buy everything, if you don't have much, getting lots of it will solve most of your problems. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. If you're from the West Coast, there's a decent chance your great-great-great-great-grandparents were some of the estimated 250,000 frontier migrants looking for that exact opportunity. It's 1849. The place to be is California, and the dream is to quite literally strike gold. The working conditions, brutal. The video essay opening hook, kinda played out, if I'm being honest. You guys know this one, right? It's one of those famous business school anecdotes. The people who most reliably got rich during the gold rush weren't the ones actually doing the digging, it was the ones selling shovels to everybody else. Turns out, offering the chance to make a lot more money than what you're charging is a pretty strong value proposition, and basically the easiest product there's ever been to sell. Get-rich-quick schemes are one of the oldest tricks in the book, and thanks to broadcast media and the internet, certain rhetorically savvy personalities are able to not just create one, but to themselves become that product. Social media ushered in a whole new wave of shady con men, finance gurus, and hustle culture influencers with varying degrees of credibility or shelf life.
Here in my garage.
But then there's Dave, the no-nonsense, old-fashioned type who's here to help you play the long game. This ain't your grandma's Gary Vee. Well, okay, he literally is that, but how about he's not just your grandma's Gary Vee? Dave Ramsey is an acclaimed media personality, best-selling author, evangelical speaker, and real estate mogul best known for offering personal finance advice through his published material and call-in show. He's also ungodly fucking rich, which must be nice, but is also, more than anything else, what lends credibility to his brand. Now, maybe you already have a neutral or even positive opinion of Dave, so I'll preface by saying this video is not about trying to prove everything he has to say about money is bad and wrong. That's just not true, and I'm no expert myself. Honestly, I'm a lot more interested in Dave Ramsey, the political project, what the deeper ideological message behind his brand of advice is getting at, and unpacking how this whole thing works. So here's where Dave, or maybe a hypothetical conservative-leaning viewer, might accuse me of making everything about politics, and I get it, we're all exhausted from this stuff right now, but I'd argue that as a very opinionated, publicly religious finance guru, his entire brand and media empire is centered around the intersection of values and economics. And at its philosophical core, what even is politics? What is it concerned with specifically, if not exactly that? It goes without saying that while I was making this video, Donald Trump was elected to a second presidential term in a popular vote landslide that no one was really predicting. So I feel comfortable claiming that understanding the animating forces behind that movement, and more importantly how the median voter fits into it, is something we're just not as good at as we'd like to think we are, and could stand to rethink for some obvious reasons. So much of the online discourse around conservatism is focused on the alt-right, the manosphere, QAnon, what the loudest voices and most radical outlets can profit from via fear-mongering and shock value. Debunking and criticizing this stuff is a necessary part of combating the growing existential threat of open fascism in America, even if it is a bit niche, bordering on self-indulgent at times. But if you've spent a significant amount of your time around down-home conservatives, I do think something at least equally important is to keep in perspective that the average casually racist suburban evangelical, so representative of the Republican base, doesn't actually have a finger on the pulse of what Matt Walsh is up to, no matter how badly he wishes they did. A lot of them aren't all that locked into the Fox News machine. A lot don't have a coherent ideology other than a culturally ingrained fear that Democrats are evil based on little more than gesturing vaguely at something like abortion. Plenty of them, despite vocally holding explicitly conservative beliefs about most issues, would even earnestly claim that they hate politics, a disconnect that I find extremely revealing. Truth is, when I think about one of the most distilled examples of rhetorically abstracting some of the most hardline boomer conservative talking points away from the broader idea of politics itself, when I think about class propaganda as faux apolitical edutainment, I think about Dave Ramsey.
If I were you, I'd start working about 80 hours a week, 90 hours a week.
Jackie's on her own.
Dave is a pretty polarizing figure for good reason. Out of context in our soundbite world, for every bit of genuinely helpful advice he puts out, you're just as likely to come across viral rants ranging anywhere from funny roasts of middle-aged married couples with zero clue how money works, to the standard crybaby whining about millennials being lazy and entitled, to some of the most brain-dead anti-working poor sentiment on the internet. I wouldn't blame anyone for not having a good sense of what he's even all about or how reasonable it comes across. When you really sit down and listen to it, one of the first things you'll notice about the type of advice you hear from Ramsey material is that it's really simple. Live within your means, prioritize saving for retirement, aggressively pay off debt, good stuff, basic stuff. It's nothing particularly nuanced or overly quantitative, which is what instead makes it approachable, fun even. And that's key to what he's actually in the business of doing here. Dave's not a financial advisor, and I don't mean to say that he's not qualified to do something like that if he ever decided to start making a lot less money, only that it's objectively not what he does professionally. Most of his gig is, this. He and his media company make money primarily through selling advertisements, as well as his books and courses for the more dedicated fans. And that business model capitalizes on the same method conservatism has always employed to dominate the independent media space online. Dave is good at the same thing all of the right's entertainment-forward ideologues are good at, making his audience feel personally addressed, speaking to the things they already care about, addressing their insecurities and gut feelings surrounding social and economic common sense, not with explicit or detailed policy, but through a more abstract politics of lifestyle. For example, his bread and butter is helping younger families get out of debt. And one of the main ways he does that is with a curated course on consumer debt and budgeting called Financial Peace University. You may notice a similar color scheme to conservative propaganda's much more notorious fake university. But as a proud alumnus myself, I wouldn't go as far as to call FPU bad advice. The worst critique I would give is that if you're not specifically a suburban fundamentalist evangelical with a substantial amount of student loan or credit card debt, most of the course either won't apply to your lifestyle or is so obvious as to be basic common sense. Ironically, I say common sense to imply that the advice isn't all that valuable to the consumer. You can, if nothing else, find this information elsewhere online very much for free. Though, to be fair, the dry, procedural information itself isn't likely to motivate anyone, and he's instead selling his whole personal flair and presentation style, not unlike a religious sermon. So from that perspective, the simplicity is valuable to Dave. His advice is all the more convincing and approachable because it is simple. It's common sense. And grounding lifestyle politics in the idea of common sense taps into a fundamental aspect of the way conservatives tend to see the world. Because, knowingly or otherwise, their underlying ideology is all about preserving societal hierarchies and the economic status quo, their own traditional conservative values are something they consider common sense, the absence of politics. Whenever progressives might show a little creativity toward imagining a better world for marginalized people, the working class, the environment, or God forbid anyone but the 1% really, that's an agenda. That's politics. And remember, I hate politics. People are both inherently nostalgic and hardwired for risk aversion. It's a big part of why we hate change so much. All fear ultimately boils down to fear of the unknown, and what could be more unknown than uncharted progress or change? For that reason, it's always so much easier to market right-wing ideas as the opposite of politics, the self-evident truths about the default state of the world. There's a specific way things are, and any deviation away from those norms is a perversion of the natural order. You see this in right-wing rhetoric all the time. For example, it's long been said that to the reactionary, there are only two races, white and political. Only two sexualities, straight and political. They do it with gender roles, religion, gun laws, whatever. It always comes back to binary thinking, a false dichotomy between conservative or political. Of course, the status quo, and principally fighting to uphold all of the ways it's designed to benefit some at the expense of others, is political. But, at least in their minds, no belief with existing ties to the current or past status quo, no matter how demonstrably harmful, bigoted, or against the material best interest of the working class conservative voter, should be considered all that radical, because at the end of the day, there's precedent for it. And to the conservative, that's worth something. Something ranging anywhere from comfortable familiarity to plausible deniability. I'm not racist or anything, I just wish they would keep all that political stuff out of my video games. Look, those people can do whatever they want, just don't shove it in my face all the time. Even the most archaic or regressive views aren't framed primarily through the obvious logistical implications of policy, but from an abstract return to when the world was a little more comfortable for folks like them. Of course, they would prefer to see themselves as anti-establishment mavericks, but it's never about moving forward with better ideas of their own, only that the other side has just gone too far. Don't you know universities are all Marxist indoctrination camps now? Transgender teenagers have infiltrated every public bathroom and women's sports league. Illegal immigrants fresh from the mental asylums are
eating the dogs.
And who cares that all of this stuff is transparently just made up bullshit? It's actually better for the narrative that it's not happening. Because if the conservative base never sees any of these sensationalized moral panics, never has to confront them for what they actually are, their imagination can let them continue believing those fears are every bit as valid as conservative pundits tell them they are. And hold on, this is all getting a little too intense. I thought we were talking about Dave Ramsey. He's the saving for retirement guy. He doesn't get into any of this culture war bullshit. Well, exactly. He's talking about the real stuff, the economic stuff, only it's still packaged with the same intention as that same absence of politics. A lot of what makes him so successful is understanding who it is he's talking to. The proverbial everyman, not nearly as interested in the minutia or the data as much as a simple narrative. And I can make you wealthy is a very simple, very compelling narrative. In Dave's view, becoming wealthy is not so much about general rules of thumb, but a particular and specific methodology. There's an obvious appeal to the simplicity in which he gamifies what becomes an almost communal process where established milestones and insider lingo create a sense of camaraderie within his fanbase. Like any other bootstraps conservative, the overt claim is that it can and should work for anyone who tries hard enough, regardless of circumstance, but he takes it a step further from the religious angle. Living a frugal and specifically debt-free lifestyle in order to become wealthy is, according to Ramsey material, not just a pragmatic opportunity to improve your circumstance and well-being, but a moral and spiritual imperative. It's more or less the same shtick as your run-of-the-mill prosperity gospel televangelist, just a little less scammy sounding, because giving Dave your money won't buy God's favor directly, just some basic financial advice you can use to earn it yourself. Dave's general approach to personal finance boils down to front-loading all of the necessary discipline and financial sacrifice toward the beginning of your life in order to prioritize retirement when you'll have eventually become wealthy. And in his opinion, this is something in virtually all cases that working-class people choose not to do. It's not that they're unable, it's that they're unwilling. This bedrock of Dave's messaging is laid out in one of his several popular catchphrases: live like no one else so that you can live like no one else. The implication being that, financially speaking, you should live like no one else is willing to early in life so that you can live like no one else can afford to later in life. Not doing so is laziness, stupidity, greed. Call it what you want, just don't call it acceptable. Being poor is a moral failure.
What I will not accept from any of you is that you can't do it.
This dynamic, where wealth is established first and foremost as a moral issue, showcases what I consider to be far and away the most interesting thing about Dave Ramsey, his relationship to his own audience. That relationship, with all of its strange inconsistencies and sources of tension, is most of what I want to go over in this video, starting with how it forces him to believe or recommend some very contradictory and impractical advice. For example, a moral condemnation of debt makes Ramsey's solutions principally against the use of credit cards under any circumstances. A frankly wild stance that has gotten them a lot of pushback for being privileged and out of touch. Of course, the modern credit system is predatory and fundamentally exploitative. I'm not defending it or convinced that it should be allowed to exist. But it is the system we have. It's a system that hurts and disenfranchises a lot of people. A lot of people who call in to Dave Ramsey for advice on how to manage their debt and what to do differently in the future, only to be insulted and humiliated to a live audience. Dave's whole curmudgeonly tough love persona can get difficult to listen to at times, but it represents a core truth of why this type of media is the way that it is. Dave is not in the business of criticizing systems, only the personal decisions of those who have no choice but to participate in them. It taps into that core tenet of conservative lifestyle politics, rugged individualism, to rarely acknowledge and definitely never consider addressing widespread systemic problems, only to take it upon yourself to make sure those problems don't personally affect you. Because what's really the problem with credit cards? They charge interest, often at overinflated or compounding rates. Spending money you might not have now will cost you more in the long run, often several times more than you ever borrowed in the first place. There can be hidden fees, they can tank your credit score, which can exacerbate existing financial struggles even more. So we could talk here about real solutions for credit cards. We could talk about consumer debt forgiveness, we could talk about abolishing credit scores or regulating interest rates. We could talk about proportionally capping the sum total of interest charges for a given amount, or better transparency up front about what monthly payments would total to, and Dave just wants no part of that. He's not here to talk policy and knows his audience isn't either. It's not a problem any of them could solve on their own individual level, only something they could choose to try and abstain from. Still, they can't help but evoke systemic language, speak to an epidemic of people recklessly choosing to go into insurmountable credit card debt for frivolous reasons.
A scary trend that's been happening for 30 years now, but it's only getting worse with time.
The way Dave and his co-hosts see it, going into non-mortgage debt is a moral transgression worth issuing strict condemnation of. Because they can't condone this as acceptable, they are ideologically forced into the bizarre argument that no one actually needs a credit card for any reason.
The word that I kept seeing over and over is, it's required. And I was like, man, the brainwashing, it has worked. It's taken
that's
full
why
effect.
I devoted a whole chapter of my book, Breaking Free from Broke, just to credit scores, because
Yeah.
I had to help people understand the very first thing before we talk about any other debt is credit scores. And it's the only 3-digit number that Americans obsess over
Man.
as much as their weight. It's crazy.
This idea falls into a regular category of Ramsey advice that is theoretically true on paper, but is so idealistic and divorced from regular people's real circumstances that it's actively counterproductive in practice. I don't like the fact that we live in a debt economy any more than Dave does, but credit scores are important. They can mean the difference between being able to sign a lease or not. They can make a difference of tens of thousands of dollars paid over the lifetime of a mortgage. And sure, paying regular bills on time and that sort of thing can slowly build up your credit too, assuming you can sign that lease for housing. But if you're not putting a couple $100s worth of groceries and gas on a credit card that you pay off every month, you're not exactly following what, for good reason, has almost always been considered the standard roadmap for building credit. You're missing out on having open lines of credit for as long as possible, which is a factor for credit scores. You could be missing out on some genuinely beneficial cash back or travel rewards. And while we're indulging this performatively controversial hot take, remember that this entire conversation is just a dishonest and obvious distraction away from the real problem they have with credit cards in the first place. It is, of course, perfectly possible to pay off the entire balance every month so that you never once in your life actually go into debt or pay a single cent worth of interest. Problem solved. To pretend otherwise comes across every bit as silly and uncompelling as claiming no one should ever treat themselves to an ice cream or glass of wine at dinner because a certain contingent of the population is inevitably going to develop morbid obesity or alcoholism. On a non-systemic personal responsibility level, the only level Dave is actually interested in, there just is no cogent argument to be made that would necessitate everyone strictly avoiding credit cards. So why do they advocate for it anyway? As best I can tell, it's simply for the purpose of having one more avenue to blame poor people's struggles on their own behavior. One more target to point at with no context or understanding and say, look, this is where you went wrong. where you weren't willing to live like no one else. It's worth acknowledging that many of the callers did dig themselves into a hole with some irresponsible credit card spending. It's not like these calls aren't screened for the show beforehand, or that Dave doesn't have a material incentive to milk the best train wrecks for entertainment value. And through that process, he gets to curate a specific narrative regarding the broader issue, one that isn't born of a system that incentivizes and rewards debt, doesn't involve people spending money they don't have because of unforeseen circumstances or out of authentic desperation, but one where all credit card debt is a product of financial illiteracy and shallow materialism. One where a poor person borrowing money they haven't earned yet is an offense that simply cannot go uncondemned. Dave does talk to rich people on his show too, we'll get to that later, but since they aren't generally in the market for entry-level personal budgeting advice, his audience is mostly poor people, and as we've seen, Dave speaks to poor people in a very specific, very loaded way.
You mean not go on vacation? You don't want me, Dave Ramsey doesn't want me to have any fun. Oh, shut up.
For them, he essentially turns personal finance into something like a religion, where certain actions are righteous and others are sinful, not necessarily based on whether the actions can or should lead to beneficial real-world outcomes, but based on the arbitrary commandments of the guy in charge who just says so. When speaking to poor people, there are no lengths the show won't go to uncover some moral shortcoming, always portraying it as a simple and obvious signifier of failure, of inadequacy. The next category of Ramsey advice you tend to hear is not quite impractical, but more unattainable. Arguably half of his advice falls into this category to some extent. Dave isn't technically anti-higher education, not openly at least, but he hates student loans, and student loan forgiveness, and his listeners working low-paying jobs, so fucking good luck trying to make sense of any of that paradox.
No student loans of any kind are good.
You're supposed to save 15% of your income for retirement, and that's after a pre-tax tithe of 10% to your local church. A little easier said than done, given the portion of Americans living paycheck to paycheck as it is. Sometimes his advice is literally just make more money. And realistically, that is about the only thing a lot of these people can do to meaningfully help their situations. Don't think that isn't my point. Take this caller and his wife on the aptly named episode, Stop Whining and Change Your Life. They make roughly $3,500 a month combined, doing what sounds like a handful of different part-time jobs. And here's Dave's best advice.
And we need to say, okay, what are we going to do that makes me $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year? How are we going to move into that in the next year and a half to 2 years so we don't work part-time the rest of our life to survive?
Ah, yes, just go out and get one of those $80,000 a year jobs that famously grow on trees for people without salaried work experience or presumably college degrees. And remember, this guy in particular can't pay for any additional training because Dave believes student loans are evil, and he's already $20,000 in credit card debt. So what is Dave talking about here? $80K isn't 1% money by any means, but people go to graduate school for jobs that pay that much. They spend years of their lives working up to those kinds of promotions. There are tons and tons of examples like this. Dave strictly recommends a 15-year fixed-rate mortgage and a plan to put extra cash against the principal in order to pay off the loan early. So pretty standard stuff. That's definitely a good long-term plan if you can swing it. It also says here he thinks ideally you should just buy a home cash, so he must live in middle of nowhere, Wyoming or something. Actually, check this real quick. Dave Ramsey location. Just gotta make sure this guy's not completely full of shit. Like 65, hang on. Wait, that's where I live.
See, look, I'm at the Parthenon. I guess I could have green screened this, but I walked here with the camera and everything and got all sweaty. Just bear with me. I promise this is going somewhere. Dave does live here in Nashville. At least he does in the way that most Americans mean when they say they live anywhere you've ever heard of, 45 minutes away in some cultureless, isolated, car-dependent suburb. I apologize for being a little elitist here, but I bring the distinction up for a reason. See, Nashville proper, where I live, is a lot like any other major city, mostly filled with younger, liberal transplants, and then a lower density sprawl of the more red state crowd out further into the outskirts, but it is somewhere the aesthetic of conservatism maps onto fairly well. Home of country music, the Southern Baptist Convention, capital and economic lifeblood of the otherwise politically archaic state of Tennessee, we're technically SEC country, even if it's just a nerdy private school that sucks at football. The Daily Wire's headquartered here now.
You know what I mean.
Right, they technically never set foot here unless it's to run around in their weird girly wigs for some reason. And of course, Dave's down past Franklin. But the thing I'm getting at, the thing that really sets Music City apart, is the housing crisis.
I know it's really bad everywhere, and I want to be sensitive to that, but the housing crisis is just on a whole other level here. And if Dave wants to go there, especially considering the state of his own backyard, we shouldn't let him get away with it this easily. A lot of you party people and bachelorettes already know that this is like the trendy destination boom city east of the Mississippi. Over the past 15 years or so, nowhere else in the country other than Austin has seen anything like this level of explosion in popularity, new development, and population growth relative to its existing size. In both cases, the strain on the already borderline non-existent public infrastructure has been a massive growing pain, and any way you slice it, there's just not enough housing to go around. But while Austin got a larger share of the investment from big tech, we took the bulk of tourism.
Some might say too much. It's me. I'm some people.
Tourism in Nashville is now an 11-figure industry annually. Unprecedented residential growth and tourism have meant that virtually all available housing in Nashville proper is priced based not what on a regular person might be willing to pay to actually live there, but by how much a wealthy investor with no intentions to ever set foot on the property can stand to earn as a landlord or Airbnb host. Listing descriptions on sites like Zillow rarely even entertain the idea that a potential buyer would do anything other than rent them out, and it's standard procedure for most units to accept a cash offer dramatically over asking price with all inspections and appraisals waived all within 24 hours. The cartoonish levels of gentrification have allowed the market to price out or displace residents at levels nearly on par with a natural disaster. And the working musicians, artists, servers, or just regular natives who directly made this such a popular place to come visit can't all afford $2,000 plus to rent a one-bedroom apartment, let alone a six-figure down payment on a starter home. A real radicalizing moment for me personally was getting functionally evicted from my last apartment just because the entire building got sold to an out-of-state property firm who decided to turn it into the mother of all Airbnbs. So rentals are scarce and artificially overpriced, and unless you have about $500,000 liquid cash, it is essentially impossible to buy property in my zip code. I've tried. Cost of living is very relative, and if you live in New York or California, you might be drooling at these kind of prices, but keep in mind that even though we're an extremely trendy major city with a skyrocketing cost of living, wages here are actually below the national average, and most sources place the median annual salary at under $60,000. All that to say, the anti-human, profit-seeking commodification of housing in Dave's own hometown is a perfect snapshot of the wider problem across most of America that makes his advice totally useless here. People aren't lazily choosing not to buy homes at 20% down on a 15-year conventional loan because they're not financially literate enough to understand that would probably be a good idea. They're feeling locked out because it's just way too expensive. I almost appreciate that he kind of gives the game away for the type of people he's really talking to with the cash comment. It's not regular working people. It's certainly not his own underpaid employees. I know that because his company is literally always hiring. It really seems like they have a high turnover rate. Somebody should look into that. Uh-oh. I am not in any way accusing foremost authority on biblical finance, Dave Ramsey, of being a hypocritical and abusive piece of shit to work for, even though many of his alleged former employees definitely are, in ways that could potentially appear to a neutral outside observer to be in accordance with a years-long pattern of behavior consistent with Dave's general ideology and personality type across multiple scandals, each with compelling levels of corroborating evidence. And that seems interesting. I have no idea how well this video is going to do, but there's got to be like a non-zero chance that some poor Ramsey PR intern is going to have to comb through the entire thing. If so, I'm seriously sorry that this is your life right now. I've watched way more of your content than you've watched of mine, so we'll call it even. Without litigating the finer details, if Dave's budgeting rules seem overly controlling, it's allegedly nothing on what he calls his righteous living policy for employees, the questionable at best legality of which reaches into the interpersonal and sexual behavior of staff even fully outside the workplace, reportedly fostering an office environment of intimidation. He's been formally accused of brandishing a loaded pistol during a staff meeting, and this leaked audio has been said by some to be pretty representative of company culture.
I don't agree with the righteous living core value. Well, why did you come, stupid? If you don't like that, this is your cue. Don't let the door hit you in the
Former Ramsey staffer Julie Ann Stamps filed workplace discrimination charges after she was allegedly coerced into resigning after she got divorced from her husband and came out as a lesbian. The federal lawsuit against Ramsey Solutions resulted in a settlement of $76,900. This is not meant as some novel expose. Everything here is publicly available and pretty well documented, and I'm not losing sleep over his personal conduct policy as if tons of hyper-progressive LGBT people are gunning to work for Ramsey Solutions or anything. It just goes to show a pattern of Dave's actions matching his rhetoric in that he's seemingly more concerned with controlling people than helping them. Brad Amos was fired from Ramsey Solutions after only about a year of employment as a senior video editor for what he claims was discrimination against his choice to take common-sense public health precautions against the coronavirus pandemic. He reports that social distancing, wearing a mask into the office, and requesting a certain amount of remote work hours out of his own religious conviction was met with extensive ridicule, and that Dave had ensured the company culture and official workplace policy was that prayer was the only acceptable measure taken against COVID-19. Most telling is his stance on COVID stimulus checks.
So I said on Fox News this morning that I don't believe in a stimulus check because if you get $600 or $1,400 and it changes your life, you didn't have a life. You're already screwed.
Yeah.
And apparently that's news to people. None of you should get it, but you're going to. Because the government is here to save the day. It's like a cartoon.
Imagine this guy being your boss, a 60-something-year-old man with a fortune so large that he and all of his children's children could each live lives of extravagant wealth, totally free from the burden of wage labor. Livid about the idea of broke or furloughed working-class people being given $700 to hopefully not starve during the most significant public health emergency of his life. Even for his own, Dave is not a hero of the working class who wants to help people. If he wanted to be, he could just do that. He's the wannabe arbiter of not political, but divine judgment for who is morally deserving to have money, and more importantly, who isn't.
And you can have the biggest fun ever when you have some money and you're not broke and whiny.
The end game of Dave's financial roadmap is to eventually retire wealthy, and that payoff is supposed to be the big reward for all your hard work, budgeting, and saving while you were young. Now you get to live like no one else, or more accurately, are in a position to live a lifestyle that few people can afford to. For illustration purposes of aspirational success stories, Dave does speak to wealthy people on his show, and the way he code switches his rhetoric is as transparent as it is unsurprising. You'll never hear Dave grill a wealthy person over whether or not they use credit cards, because presumably, and by presumably I mean obviously, they do. Where he does have an opportunity to disclose the ways in which rich and poor people are not at all playing the same game by the same rules when it comes to earning money, not just spending it, that point is left merely implied. Instead, he drops all of the usual scrutiny or interest in the details in a way that goes beyond just giving wealthy callers the benefit of the doubt. For example, the show has a fascination with the somewhat arbitrary milestone of being a millionaire, which Dave is insistent on defining in terms of the total net worth of all cash and illiquid assets minus debts. And for the sake of argument, let's just grant him that that's the most practical definition for regular people who don't own multiple properties or significant market stakes in entire companies. Fine. If you're a millionaire, Dave wants to talk to you.
I don't care how you became a millionaire, where your money came from. All I know is you're a millionaire and I want to talk to you.
Even though he stacked the deck this heavily with the obvious selection bias, what Dave doesn't do in this segment, what he intentionally avoids doing, is getting specific testimonial insight into how FPU or any of his other methods were able to help the millionaires get to where they're at. The fact that they're wealthy is enough proof in and of itself that they must have followed Dave's general advice, and that's something anyone can do. This is an incredibly effective rhetorical deception popular among preachers who want to pretend their preferred one-size-fits-all approach is foolproof. It's a mindset meant to ensure that no lived experience to the contrary could ever invalidate the guaranteed success of whatever formula they're selling, but only serve as evidence of not following it properly. Did you pray for something that didn't work out? Not hard enough you didn't, or you got your answer but interpreted it the wrong way. Maybe there's sin in your heart. Are you sure you're a real Christian? Here, Jimmy Evans gives one of my favorite examples regarding marriage.
What I want you to know is marriage works 100% of the time when you do it God's way. Let me say it another way. You have a 100% chance of success in marriage when you do it God's way. You don't have a 50% chance. You don't have a 90% chance.
You have a 100% chance.
Guys, I don't know how to break this to you, but everything has a 100% success rate if you decide to only count the successes. How is this helpful to anyone? You're just playing word games with yourself. Well, it's not supposed to be. The circular reasoning is the point. You claim that something always works for anyone as long as they do it right, then define the criteria for what that even means as whether or not it worked. It's unfalsifiable. With almost no context or nuance, the small minority at the top serve as proof that anyone can do it, and the much larger group of everyone else gets relegated to the advice segments for people who haven't quite figured this whole thing out yet. This is the heart of Dave's propaganda in a nutshell. The point of the segment is, in his own words,
to show you that it can be done,
not to explain how, and that obvious lack of practical insight from the millionaires is what makes this segment so awkward to listen to. Take 42-year-old Ginny from Seattle with a net worth of $1.4 million. She's been a stay-at-home mom for, quote, almost 20 years, and she's even had kids for 13 of them, which probably helps. Her husband earns $150,000 a year with a premium retirement package, and they own a home together in a high cost of living area. That's generally the common theme in this segment. And honestly, goals, that's awesome, good for them. People like this are not the problem. So, caveat time. Domestic and reproductive work is extremely important, yet rapidly becoming a luxury that few families can afford to prioritize full time. The fact that it is generally considered somehow lesser and not worth compensating says a lot about society, and the expectations we often take for granted and disproportionately place on women. Do not get weird and sexist in the comments. That being said, respectfully, what the fuck does this random trad wife know about how to become a millionaire? Maybe she is an absolute rock star at budgeting or couponing or negotiating. Maybe she made some really smart investment decisions with their accounts. I don't know because Dave doesn't ask. One of the only clarifying questions Dave does ask is what her middle-aged husband's GPA was in college, a laughably asinine and irrelevant way to professionally evaluate anyone who isn't fresh out of undergrad.
I think that if you educate yourself, be your own advocate, and are really intentional, distill down what you find value in and place it in that, then you can be budgeted, all those things. I think you can get there.
The millionaires offer so little practical insight into anything because, again, that's not why they were invited on. Hers are just a few vapid platitudes before Dave cuts her off to ask and then rave about them driving relatively modest, practical cars. The show will latch onto anything that the average person could hypothetically do budget-wise to avoid bringing up the obvious. Only the top 10% of American workers earn that much money, and the overwhelming majority of jobs don't pay anywhere close to $150K. There are only so many homes up for sale in high cost of living areas. And all of that is kind of obvious, isn't it? Upward mobility within the neoliberal free market economy that Dave would defend to his dying breath is a game of musical chairs with only so many seats to go around, a number that continues to get fewer and fewer the longer we keep playing the game. We might as well be talking about gambling or the lottery. The odds are worse, but the dynamic is the same. When almost everyone loses and becomes just a little bit worse off, it's business as usual happening in silence. And when someone makes it big, it's front page news or a flashy casino siren. Dave's millionaires embody that same quintessential relationship between wealth and media, weaponizing the narrative of upward mobility, dangling the idea that hypothetically you could to distract you from the reality that statistically you won't. When it comes to that American Protestant work ethic, meritocracy has always been a myth, and widening inequality has always been the entire point. Economists and researchers, even infuriatingly centrist ones, know this well. When a shortage of adequate jobs exists on this scale, a tremendous crowding occurs. Even people with above-average educational credentials and above-average ambition will be forced, in surprising numbers, to take jobs that fail to bring them into the societal mainstream, and many workers in low-paying jobs will be unable to move up. A substantial shortage of adequate jobs does not mean that no opportunity exists at all, that no one will find job openings enabling them to rise from poverty to independence. It does mean that many millions of responsible and hardworking people will not be so fortunate. Dave's argument against this type of pushback is that it robs people of hope. Reasonable analysis that contradicts the simple narrative is dismissed as the same fear, uncertainty, and doubt that you see in any high-control group setting.
When you go down these stupid nerd rabbit holes in these Reddit threads with these morons who live in their mother's basement with a calculator, and then you put that out into the dadgum community, and then people go, I don't have enough money. It's hopeless. I'll never be able to save enough to retire.
An unsurprising response, given that his business model is dependent on people having hope, no matter how likely it is to be a false hope.
And a lot of the studies I found showed
there's a lot of studies that are stupid in this space. That's why I'm pissed about it, because it's hope stealing with super nerds.
And that betrays his image of trustworthiness, shows the ways he has to turn a blind eye to the real factors that keep his callers from financial success, even when those factors have nothing to do with unwillingness to live like no one else. Dave is in an almost singularly unique position to understand all of this from the thousands of people who call him, and to sympathize with their struggles, to recognize the countless exceptions to following his strict rules, or the glaring reality that the way to have money is to make money, and the easiest way by far to make money is to already have money. But in his unwillingness to acknowledge circumstantial and perpetuating factors of poverty, and desire to serve as the closest thing we have to an ultimate authority, Dave has constructed a childishly oversimplified fiction where wealth is directly and solely correlated to simply understanding money, thereby proving yourself worthy of it. And nearly every interaction with his own audience, both rich and poor, is an exercise in concealing the fragility of that fiction. They each end the same way, with Dave unceremoniously hanging up the phone at a point which is usually both unexpected for the caller and largely undetectable by the viewer, a perfect representation, I think, of his relationship to his own audience. A deceptive sleight of hand so that no one ever accidentally gives the game away, never makes apparent the ways in which poor callers actually do follow Dave's rules, or the way rich people often don't. Because these similarities, in behavior if not circumstance or results, are what speak to the inherent contradiction of Dave's philosophy, the doublethink required to make it truly coherent. Trust me, he says, there is a rigid set of commands and inputs that reliably manifest wealth. It's an arduous path of the determined few, one that requires a detailed precision down to the single dollar. But also, no, it isn't. Money is simple common sense. Anyone can learn mastery over it, and the people who've already done so can offer the rest of us nothing beyond trite pseudo-inspirational prose that you'd see from a takeout fortune cookie, and that's all we should even expect of them. It's worth noting that the Ramsey millionaires almost always have their net worth tied up in inaccessible retirement accounts and illiquid assets. In terms of actual living standard and real purchasing power, the millionaire's wealth relative to anyone with similar housing arrangements in significantly lower cost areas is mostly an immaterial technicality that only exists on paper. Dave gives Ginny from Seattle's husband his blessing to buy a nicer car, but they aren't living large in the like no one else sense yet. Obviously, these guys are plenty well off for fairly normal working people, but they'd need to sell their house, age another 2 decades, and dip into their retirement account to access or materialize their current net worth. They're aspirational, but still very much on the grind for the foreseeable future, because up until then, enough is never really enough with Dave's roadmap for investing, to the point where you never seem to get rich even when you do. I'd like to tell a quick personal story about high school and about investing. To pass the time during one of my free periods senior year, I played a lot of a computer game called Bloons Tower Defense. The basic game mechanic is there's a track that balloons go down, and if enough of them get to the end, you lose. So you have to spend a limited amount of money that you earn each round to buy different types of little characters and traps to pop the growing number of balloons for you, while they start to get faster and stronger as the game progresses. I realized I could also spend a bunch of money between rounds on these little farms that don't pop balloons but generate passive income for you. Naturally, I figured out how to spend the least amount of money possible to just barely survive while dumping every possible resource into building and upgrading these farms. The actual game itself starts to kind of pass you by at this point, and you're just doing the absolute bare minimum to stay alive while you focus on getting more and more money out of your investments. During the mid-game, there's no real threat or strategy involved since you have almost unlimited money to spend against your basically non-existent problems, and you're literally just fast-forwarding through levels and barely even consciously playing anymore. Eventually, you look up and notice that you beat the game a few rounds back, and now you're just playing through bonus levels. These get ridiculously hard as millions of super-powered balloons race by at speed, and so you finally hit that equilibrium. You've got more money than you could ever spend, even if you wanted to, so you cover every pixel of the screen with the strongest items in the game. Thing is, the game is programmed to just go on indefinitely until you lose, so it's still never enough. They get stronger and stronger, faster and faster. You're just barely holding them off. Your screen is a mess. You notice your computer lagging behind and starting to drop frames from everything happening all at once, and then inevitably the game crashes. It's all over. I've refrained as much as possible from criticizing Dave's religion or bringing up any of the relevant Atheism 101 style talking points. I don't think that's what either one of us is looking for from this video, but I can't not point out the obvious here. Christians believe they are going to live forever.
Pretend this rope just goes on forever, okay? Just imagination. Pretend it goes around the world a few times. It doesn't. It ends at the rock. You see this red part? This would represent your time on earth. The Bible teaches that what I do during this little red part determines how I'm going to exist for millions and millions and millions of years forever.
The short stage of your life spent on Earth that determines the fate of your soul's eternity, in that sense the only part that really matters, also doesn't. It's a microscopic blip in the grand scheme of forever that can only serve as a tutorial for your real purpose in the afterlife. The part that no one can tangibly point to or observe, the length of the rope off screen that doesn't actually exist, that we have to imagine for the sake of analogy. I'm not a Christian, sorry mom and dad, so as far as I'm concerned, and regardless of what we might believe, as far as anyone actually knows for sure, the life we're living right now is the only one we're ever gonna get. That can be a scary thought. I won't sit here and pretend it doesn't keep me up at night sometimes, but it's also empowering in a way. It stands to reason that life is all the more precious because it is finite, and that's not just supply and demand, it's an important perspective with a lot of weight behind it, one worth exploring that I think undermines Dave's whole philosophy on investment in a lot of ways.
What blows me away is some of you, all you think about is this red part. It's all you think about. You're consumed with this. You go, oh man, I can't wait till here. You know, I'm going to work hard. I'm going to save so I can really enjoy this part right here.
Anybody who knows anything about this stuff will tell you that the golden rule of investing is to diversify. It broadens your growth opportunities while minimizing risk. Putting all your eggs in one basket is a dangerous game. That's true of money, and it's true of most things in life. And to that point, I think that by obsessing over retirement, Dave's vision for success is senselessly farsighted and fundamentally broken. When you strip away the obligatory moral and spiritual gravity, it loses a whole lot of its appeal. At least it does if you don't buy that going all in on retirement or even becoming exceptionally wealthy in old age are the be-all end-all of investing when it comes to your life. Everything spent now will be that much less you'll have accumulated later, but you can't take it with you when you're gone, not even in Christian theology. There's only so much you can save before it no longer benefits you in any real way, and you're just saving money you'd be better off spending for the sake of saving. Forgoing preventative doctor visits because they're pricey, or pinching pennies every meal, barely sustaining yourself off of boy dinner is probably not a good strategy for your long-term health. Spending the first 5 years of marriage living in your parents' basement while both earning 6 figures probably isn't a good way to make the kind of memories you'd like to look back on. Working 90-hour weeks isn't a good investment in your mental stability. Skipping out on that bucket list trip or time off work with family and friends is one step closer to that opportunity passing you by once it's too late. In a world where tomorrow is never guaranteed, spending the prime of your life forgoing all of the simple pleasures and meaningful human experiences that make life worth living simply for the victimless imaginary crime of not being wealthy is a pathetic forfeiture of existence. It's a glimpse into the real way Dave Ramsey views the working poor as practically subhuman. That's his entire rhetorical divide between the only two classes of people as he sees them. There exists a righteous few who've proven themselves worthy of the privilege to spend their own money the way they see fit, but no one else. Everyone on the outside or at the bottom is not allowed to. They're obligated to keep chasing a sort of financial salvation, no matter how mathematically unlikely they are to ever catch it before they die. And if there's one thing I do think no one should buy, it's that idea. A couple months ago, I bought this camera to start using instead of secretly borrowing a cheap one from my day job. It's pretty nice. I spent a decent chunk of money on it, one that could have grown into a much larger chunk of money once I'm Dave's age if I'd have just thrown it into a Roth IRA. And I didn't spend that money because it was the safest, most straightforward way to optimize my long-term financial future. I didn't do it because I know for sure it will eventually pay for itself. I did it because right now, I really enjoy making videos. Some people seem to like them so far. I think I'm pretty good at it. I'd love to get a lot better. Working on this little hobby YouTube channel has turned into one of the not too many things I'm actually passionate about and makes me excited to wake up every day. I don't think you can put a price on that. Life is really short, and we all owe it to ourselves to make the most of it while we can. I'm not saying that long-term financial planning isn't important, but there is so much more to the concept of investing than putting away every bit you can toward passive stock market returns decades in the making. Dave might think I'm wrong, and maybe I am, but I just can't envision myself on my deathbed looking back wishing I'd put away just a little bit more into the pot for my sunset years. But I know I'd always regret not investing in and betting on myself to see what I could turn this into, even if it's nothing more than just getting a little bit better at a fun hobby. That's probably not very relatable, not directly at least, but everyone's priorities are different, and I'm willing to bet we all have something worth splurging on just a little bit. That's got to be a better philosophy for investing, even if it breaks some arbitrary rules passed down from on high from someone who knows they're the exception who will never actually have to follow them himself. Dave's most pandering and insincere catchphrase can be heard anytime someone asks him how he is doing. A usually clunky and unnecessary pleasantry that callers almost seem to have been prompted to open with so that he can algorithmically regurgitate the stock response of,
"Better than I deserve."
Far be it from me to armchair psychoanalyze someone I've never even met, but if Dave is genuinely happy doing what he does, it just doesn't come across in his show all that well. Every time he recites his little mantras and catchphrases, it's so hollow and forced. It just doesn't seem like his heart is really in it anymore, with the sole exception of berating and disciplining the least fortunate of his callers. Performative self-disparagement, or what we might call pick-me humility, runs deep within religious communities. In a worldview where every day not spent being tortured in hell is an unearned gift of infinite mercy from God himself, what material problems could any of us really have? Regardless of status, we're all ultimately in a better position than we have any right not to be endlessly grateful for, doing better than we deserve. That false equivalence does to Dave's audience what no true material analysis or other type of rhetorical technique ever could. It makes them his equal. Dave doesn't lay claim to this catchphrase because he believes it, at least not in a way that's authentically reflected through his actions. He claims it because he wants you, the viewer, to believe it. Of course, Dave is nowhere close to being your financial equal. He's worth reportedly hundreds of millions of dollars, astronomically more wealth than anyone could ever need. More wealth than any regular person could realistically comprehend. An amount that should embarrass anyone who pays lip service to the teachings of the Jesus of the Bible whenever it suits them. You'd imagine some part of him has to reckon with an increasing desperation to convince himself that any of this is fair and all of the gross dehumanization of poor people that must accompany that goal. That's why everything he wants to pass as common sense advice is secondary and subservient to the real goal of legitimizing the inherent goodness to hoarding a reprehensible level of wealth for himself, while most people on Earth and countless members of his own audience have far, far less than they need just to get by. I'm not here to claim that basic financial literacy and living within your means aren't important factors for your long-term future. Discipline is freedom. I won't be that leftist caricature he might want me to be by pretending otherwise. It's not like I don't personally do close enough to some of the things he recommends. I'm actually an extremely frugal guy. I cut my own hair, okay, and it's not because I'm good at it. I benefit from at least what might as well be some of these ideas, and you might too. But it's still all the more reason to be cautious and skeptical of the broader rhetoric. A strength of Ramsey Media is that it isn't first and foremost a grift. There are plenty of somewhat helpful tips and convenient half-truths in a lot of what he has to say, but that doesn't mean that the wider project isn't categorically propaganda. It doesn't mean that he is ideologically on your side or wants good things for the demographic his own customers belong to more than he wants to continue to enrich himself by selling them something. No matter how bitter and aggrieved he might feel toward a culture where not everyone thoughtlessly accepts the status quo or thinks exactly like he does, the obvious fact remains that the world we live in is built by people like Dave for people like Dave. He belongs to the exclusive handful of increasingly powerful yet vanishingly few business owners and oligarchs who actually benefit from you working 90 hours a week, or spending $100 on his budgeting course, or voting conservative, or simply putting eyeballs on his show to let him tell you what to think. To let him sell you a worldview that values your moral worth based on your bank statement first and your humanity second. Dave doesn't hate politics, and he certainly doesn't stay out of them. He has ethically and intellectually bankrupt politics, and he wants you to have them too. If you're a person with a job or debt, or have self-selected as a potential consumer for financial advice, think critically about who's offering it to you and what incentives or ulterior motives they might have in making theirs the most readily available or charging a premium for it. I'm no expert in how to become worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but I'm reasonably certain it isn't by making your business decisions out of the kindness of your heart. Remember that as an exorbitantly wealthy and powerful business owner, a well-connected celebrity, and a fairly mainstream media pundit, whatever underlying political message is in Dave Ramsey's best interest is not also in yours. How could it be?